The ring keeps a record, not of what the prospect sheet said, not of what the promoters promised, not of the pound-for-pound lists or the pay-per-view numbers. It keeps a record of what actually happened to the body that walked through the ropes. For most fighters, that record is a scar, a bad night, a nose that sets wrong. For a small number of them, it is everything they were, taken in one evening in front of a television audience by rules that existed specifically to prevent exactly what happened. Prichard Colón died today. He was 33 years old. The injury that killed him was inflicted on the 17th of October, 2015, and it took almost 11 years to finish the job. His father, Richard, who was also his trainer through his entire amateur and professional career, announced it on Facebook this morning. He wrote that his son had passed from this earthly world and that he was now in a better one. His mother, Nieves, confirmed it separately to Telemundo Puerto Rico. As of this afternoon, the family has not released a cause of death, and they are not obliged to. They have given the public more than a decade of updates already, and buried inside his father's message was one detail that has broken people who read it. Richard wrote that he had done everything possible to fulfill his son's wish, his dream of taking him back to Puerto Rico for a vacation, and that he could not do it. Not a world title, not a comeback, not a miracle. A vacation. He wanted to go home to the island, and the man who had spent 11 years lifting him, feeding him, turning him, and speaking for him could not give him that one thing. To understand why that sentence hits the way it does, you have to understand who he was before. Prichard Colón Melendez was born on the 19th of September 1992 in Maitland, Florida. He was American by birth and Puerto Rican by everything else, because when he was 10 years old, his father made a decision that shaped the rest of his life. Richard moved him to Puerto Rico so that his son could represent the island in competition. Prichard went with his younger sister. His mother and older brother stayed behind in Florida. They settled in Orocovis, a rural town in the mountains at the geographic center of Puerto Rico. It is the sort of place that produces one athlete every generation and never stops talking about him. He was extraordinary almost immediately. He fought out of the Albergue Olímpico, the island's Olympic training center, and in 2010, he won gold at the Pan American Youth Championship at 64 kilograms. They called him Dig It. He was 6 feet tall with a 74-inch reach at welterweight, which is an unusual and genuinely dangerous frame for the division, and he had power in both hands. He turned professional in 2013, and then he did what a can't-miss prospect is supposed to do. He won, and he won by knockout. 16 fights, 16 wins, 13 of them by stoppage. He fought at Barclays Center in Brooklyn. He fought in Toronto. He was on premier boxing champions cards on network television in the United States before he was 23 years old, which is a level of exposure most fighters spend a decade chasing. He was being talked about as the next great Puerto Rican fighter, in a country that produces them at a rate no other territory of its size can match, and that is not a small sentence. That lineage runs through Wilfredo Gomez, Felix Trinidad, Miguel Cotto. Puerto Rico does not hand that comparison out casually. He was 23, he was undefeated. The people around him believed a world title was a matter of scheduling, and then came Fairfax, Virginia, the 17th of October, 2015, Eagle Bank Arena, an NBC televised card. The opponent was Terrel Williams, an unbeaten welterweight out of Los Angeles, and on paper this was a step up, but not a wall. What happened over those 9 rounds has been dissected frame by frame for a decade, and the basic facts are not really in dispute. Colón was repeatedly struck to the back of the head, rabbit punches, which are illegal in boxing for exactly one reason. The base of the skull and the upper spine are the least protected, most catastrophic place on a human being to absorb repeated impact. He complained to the referee, Joseph Cooper, about the blows. Williams was eventually deducted a point for it. The fight was chaotic in other ways too. Colón was deducted 2 points for a low blow. He was dropped twice in the 9th round. And then, at the end of the 9th, came the moment that turned an ugly fight into a piece of boxing folklore for all the wrong reasons. Believing the fight was over, his corner removed his gloves. Under the rules, that is a disqualification. The official result went into the record book as a loss, 16-1. That is the entire professional record of Prichard Colón. 16 wins, 13 knockouts, and one disqualification he did not choose in the last fight he would ever have. The record book is the least important thing that happened that night, because by the time he reached the dressing room, he was already dying. He became dizzy. He vomited. His mother was there. His father was there. He was rushed to a Fairfax hospital, and a CT scan found a subdural hematoma, bleeding between the brain and the skull, with pressure building against tissue that has nowhere to expand. Surgeons performed an emergency procedure to relieve that pressure, removing part of his skull. It saved his life. It could not give him back. His mother described being in the ambulance. His father described believing in that moment that his son was going to die in front of him. He did not die. He went into a coma, and he stayed there for 221 days. Sit with that number for a second, because most people read past it. 221 days. 7 months. His family sat in rooms in Virginia, then in Atlanta at a specialist center for brain and spinal injuries, then in more rooms after that, watching a machine breathe for a 23-year-old athlete and waiting for something that never fully arrived. When he came out of it, he could not walk. He could not speak. He was in a persistent, vegetative state, and later, in the years that followed, he progressed to being able to communicate in limited ways. Eventually, with the help of a computer, he recognized people. He responded. His family posted videos of small victories, a movement, a reaction, a flicker of the person they knew. And now the title of this video, which I want to be honest about, because it is not the kind of title this story usually gets. This is not the same Prichard Colón. That is not a comeback line. That is the tragedy stated plainly. There were 2 Prichard Colóns, and the boundary between them is a single evening in Virginia. The first one was 23 years old, 6 feet tall, undefeated, funny, loud, obsessed with the sport, carrying an island's expectations and enjoying every second of it. He had a nickname his friends used. He had plans. He had a career mapped out that everyone around him believed in. The second one spent nearly 11 years in a body that would not answer him, cared for around the clock by his mother and his father, unable to go to the place he was from. The sport that made the first one did not make the second one. It just left him there. And here is what makes this different from the ordinary tragedy of a hard sport. Boxing is dangerous, and everybody who steps into it knows that. Fighters accept a risk. That is the arrangement, and it is understood by both sides. Nobody is naive about it, but rabbit punching is not part of that arrangement. It is illegal. It is illegal specifically because the sport recognized, a long time ago, that hitting a man in the back of the head produces injuries that the sport's safety rules cannot manage. It sits in the rule book next to headbutts and low blows for exactly that reason. An investigative report released by the state of Virginia the following year concluded that while what happened to Colón was tragic, there was no single action apparent or egregious enough to lay blame on any one person. The family did not participate in that investigation. They retained an attorney. And that is where the story of accountability essentially stopped. There was no villain the sport was willing to name. There was a referee doing a job in real time, a corner that made a decision in confusion, a commission that reviewed itself, a fighter who threw punches in a fight, and a young man who never came home. Which brings up Terrel Williams, and this needs saying carefully, because there is a second life inside this story that people forget about. Williams has carried that night for 11 years too. He has spoken publicly about it more than once, saying he never intended to harm anybody like that, and wishing Colón peace and health. He was interviewed by the state investigation. He was cleared of wrongdoing in any formal sense. He also could never really escape it. For the rest of his career, his name appeared in the same sentence as one of the worst outcomes in modern American boxing, and it will appear there again today in every article written about this. You can believe that the punches to the back of the head were illegal and should have been stopped sooner, and simultaneously believe that Terrel Williams did not walk into that ring intending to end a man's life. Both of those things are true, neither of them helps. The World Boxing Council named Prichard Colón an honorary world champion. It is a gesture, and it is a decent one, and everybody involved understood exactly what it was. He never got to fight for a real one. Then came almost 11 years that the public mostly did not see. This is the part of the story that gets compressed into a sentence in most articles, and it deserves better than that. Because between October 2015 and this morning, a family did something extraordinary and almost entirely unnoticed. Nieves Colón, his mother, became his full-time carer. So did his father. That is not a metaphor for grief. That is lifting a grown man. That is feeding, turning, cleaning, medicating, transporting, and advocating every single day for a decade, while the world moved on to the next fight card. They kept him at home. They kept posting. They kept celebrating things most people would not recognize as victories. They fought for equipment, for therapy, for access, for the technology that eventually let him communicate. They did all of it with an audience that periodically remembered him, went viral for a week, and then forgot again until the next anniversary. That is the actual story of Prichard Colón, and it barely involves boxing at all. 11 years of a family refusing to let a man disappear. And the wish, the vacation. His father said it plainly this morning in a public post on the day his son died. Prichard wanted to go back to Puerto Rico. Richard tried to make it happen and could not. You have to understand what that trip would have required. A man requiring full-time medical care, flying to an island, with equipment, with staff, with cost, with risk. It is not a plane ticket. It is a logistical operation most families cannot fund, and most airlines cannot easily accommodate. So it stayed on a list of things they were going to do for years, until this morning, when it became a thing that will not happen. He was 10 years old when his father moved him to Orocovis so he could represent the island. He was 23 when he stopped being able to go back. He died in the United States at 33, wanting to see the place he was raised. That is the sentence that should stay with people today, and not the fight footage. So what does this actually mean for the sport? And what should be said honestly on a day like this? The video of that fight has been watched tens of millions of times. It has become a genre unto itself, one of those clips that circulates through combat sports as a warning, or worse, as content. Every few months, it resurfaces. Every time it does, there are comments arguing about the corner, about the referee, about the rabbit punches, about what should have happened. The argument never resolves because the sport has never wanted it to resolve. Resolving it would require somebody to accept responsibility, and boxing's regulatory structure is specifically arranged so that no single body has to. There is no central authority. There are state commissions, each with their own standards, their own doctors, their own review processes, and a promoter's card to keep moving. An investigation that concludes nobody was egregiously at fault is the natural product of a system built that way. Colón's case did produce conversation about ringside neurological protocols, about referees' obligations on repeated illegal blows to the head, about post-fight monitoring in the dressing room, which is where his symptoms actually appeared. Some things changed at the margins, most did not. And the truth is that fighters still absorb rabbit punches in almost every clinch-heavy fight you will watch this year. And referees still warn rather than deduct, and cards still run late, and dressing rooms still empty out fast. There is no version of this where boxing becomes safe. That is not the ask. The ask is smaller and more achievable, which is that the rules already written to prevent this specific injury get enforced like they matter. Prichard Colón is the strongest argument anybody has ever made for that, and it cost him everything to make it. Here is the last thing, and it is the part I keep coming back to. He was aware, not in the way he had been, but in the years after he emerged from that coma, he recognized his family. He responded. He communicated with assistants. He knew who he was, and he knew what had been taken. His father spoke about his son's wishes because his son had wishes and expressed them, and one of them was to go home. That is not a man who was absent for 11 years. That is a man who was present for 11 years, inside a body that would not cooperate, watching a sport he loved carry on without him, in a country that was not the one he wanted to be in. We spend a lot of time in combat sports talking about heart. It is the most overused word in the entire vocabulary. It gets applied to a fighter who takes a beating for 15 minutes and gets a bonus for it. Prichard Colón did 11 years. So did his mother. So did his father, who this morning announced the death of his own son and used the space to thank people for their prayers and to apologize, essentially, for a vacation he could not arrange. The record book says 16-1. It says his last professional result was a disqualification loss on the 17th of October, 2015 in Fairfax, Virginia. The record book is wrong about almost everything that matters here. What actually happened is that a 23-year-old from Orocovis walked into a building on a Saturday night with a perfect record and a future. And what walked out was somebody else entirely, and his family loved that person, without pause, for the next decade. This is not the same Prichard Colón, and it has not been since 2015. That is the whole story, and it ended this morning. He was 33 years old. Rest in peace to Prichard Colón, and strength to Richard, Nieves, and the rest of his family, who did more for 11 years than most people will do in a lifetime. If you take one thing from this, do not make it the fight footage. Make it the part where a father spent a decade trying to get his son to an island and ran out of time.